The text message glowed on David's phone screen like a neon sign in the darkness of our bedroom. "Your wife doesn't satisfy you," followed by a string of explicit promises that made my stomach turn. I can still see those words burned into my retina, each letter a tiny dagger cutting through 8 years of what I thought was a solid marriage. The phone had buzzed on his nightstand while he showered, and instinctively I'd glanced over thinking it might be work. David always got calls at odd hours from his tech company. What I found instead was Ashley Chen, his so-called business colleague, texting my husband at 11:47 p.m. with the kind of intimate knowledge about our private life that should have been impossible for her to possess. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Jessica Martinez, and until that moment, I thought I knew exactly who I was. At 34, I'd built what everyone considered the perfect life in our Westlake Hills neighborhood in Austin. I was the woman who remembered everyone's birthdays, who organized the annual block party, who somehow managed to run a successful marketing consultancy while keeping our custom lakeside home looking like something out of Better Homes and Gardens. I was the wife who meal prepped David's lunches every Sunday, who attended every company function with a smile, who supported his dreams of expanding TechFlow Solutions, even when it meant sacrificing my own ambitions time and time again. The water was still running in our master bathroom as I stared at that phone, my hands trembling slightly as the full implications crashed over me. This wasn't just infidelity. This was systematic betrayal with someone I'd actually welcomed into our home. Ashley had been to our dinner parties. She'd sat at my kitchen island drinking the wine I'd carefully selected, complimenting my cooking while apparently planning to steal my husband. The casual cruelty of it hit harder than the actual affair itself. I'd met David 9 years ago at a marketing conference in downtown Austin. He was presenting on emerging technologies, and I was captivated by his passion for innovation. Back then, he seemed genuinely interested in my work, asking thoughtful questions about consumer psychology and brand development. Our courtship felt like a partnership of equals, two ambitious professionals, building something beautiful together. He proposed on Lady Bird Lake during sunset, promising we'd always support each other's dreams. I'd believed him completely. The early years of our marriage had their challenges, but I'd attributed them to normal growing pains. David worked long hours establishing TechFlow with his business partner Steve Johnson, and I threw myself into building my client base at the marketing firm, where I'd started as a junior account executive. We bought our dream house on Lakeside Drive when I was 28, a sprawling contemporary structure with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the water. I'd spent months working with the interior designer, choosing every fixture and finish to create the perfect space for the family we planned to build. That family never materialized, though not for lack of trying. 3 miscarriages in 5 years had taken their toll on both of us, but I'd assumed we were grieving together, supporting each other through the disappointment. David had seemed understanding, even suggesting we take a break from trying and focus on our careers for a while. Now I wondered if that suggestion had less to do with emotional healing and more to do with his wandering attention. Standing there in my silk pajamas, staring at evidence of my husband's betrayal, I felt something fundamental shift inside me. The Jessica who'd spent 8 years bending herself into the shape of the perfect wife, who'd compromised her own career advancement to support David's ambitions, who'd made herself smaller to make him feel bigger, the Jessica died in that moment. What rose in her place was someone harder, clearer, and infinitely more dangerous than David had ever imagined possible. The bathroom door opened, releasing a cloud of steam along with my husband's off-key humming. David emerged with a towel wrapped around his waist, completely oblivious to the fact that his entire world was about to change. At 36, he still maintained the lean build that had first attracted me, his dark hair now touched with premature silver that gave him a distinguished look. He'd always been vain about his appearance, spending more on grooming products than I spent on my entire wardrobe. Tonight, that vanity felt like another insult, another sign of his selfishness. "You're up late," he commented, running another towel through his hair. "Everything okay?" The casual normalcy of his tone almost made me laugh. Everything was decidedly not okay, but David's ability to compartmentalize had always been one of his strengths in business. Apparently, it served him equally well in adultery. I watched him move around our bedroom, putting on the expensive pajamas I'd given him for Christmas, completely comfortable in his deception. "Just couldn't sleep," I replied, my voice steady despite the chaos in my chest. "You know how it is." But David wasn't really listening, already distracted by something on his laptop. This, too, was familiar, his habit of partial attention that had grown more pronounced over the years. When had I stopped demanding his full focus? When had I accepted these conversational scraps as sufficient? The questions felt important suddenly, as if understanding the timeline of our deterioration might somehow explain how we'd arrived at Ashley Chen's midnight messages. I returned to my side of the bed, David's phone now silent and dark on his nightstand. He'd changed his passcode recently, I realized, remembering how it used to be our anniversary. Another small detail that should have raised flags if I'd been paying attention. But I'd been busy being the perfect wife, managing our social calendar and our home, while building my own career in the margins of his life. The marketing firm where I worked, Martinez Associates, bore my name but had never felt entirely mine. I'd started there fresh out of UT with a master's in communications, working my way up from account coordinator to senior strategist. My specialty was rebranding campaigns for companies in crisis, helping them reshape their public image and reconnect with their target audience. The irony wasn't lost on me that I'd become an expert at reinventing other people's identities while losing sight of my own. My most successful campaign had been for a local restaurant chain that was hemorrhaging customers due to a food safety scandal. I'd developed a comprehensive strategy that focused on transparency, community engagement, and incremental trust building. Within 18 months, they'd not only recovered their original customer base but expanded to 3 new locations. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The campaign had won 2 industry awards and established my reputation as someone who could salvage seemingly hopeless situations. Now, lying in the darkness beside my cheating husband, I wondered if those same skills might be applicable to my personal life. The thought was both terrifying and exhilarating. I'd spent so long defining myself in relation to David that I'd forgotten who Jessica Martinez might be on her own terms. Sleep was impossible, so I spent the remaining hours before dawn doing what I did best: strategic analysis. I mentally cataloged our shared assets, our individual debts, our joint and separate accounts. David had always handled our finances, claiming his business background made him better suited for investment decisions. I'd accepted this arrangement, focusing on my own earnings while trusting him to manage our shared portfolio. Another mistake that suddenly seemed glaringly obvious. Our house alone was worth nearly $800,000, most of it equity we'd built over 6 years of payments. My marketing consultancy generated steady income, but David's tech company had been particularly successful lately, landing several major contracts that had significantly boosted our household earnings. On paper, we looked like the American dream: successful professionals, beautiful home, comfortable lifestyle. The reality was considerably more complex. I thought about Ashley Chen, trying to remember every interaction we'd had over the past year. She'd joined TechFlow as a project manager about 18 months ago, and David had spoken of her talents enthusiastically from the beginning. Too enthusiastically, I now realized. She was brilliant, he'd said. Innovative. A real asset to the company. He'd invited her to our 4th of July barbecue, where she'd charmed everyone with her quick wit and apparent genuine interest in getting to know David's wife. I remembered her complimenting my landscaping, asking detailed questions about the native plants I'd chosen for our xeriscaped garden. She'd seemed genuinely interested in my work too, mentioning a startup client who might benefit from rebranding consultation. At the time, I'd appreciated her friendliness, her effort to connect with me beyond just being David's colleague. Now every memory felt contaminated by the knowledge of her true intentions. The affair had probably been going on for months, maybe longer. David's increased travel schedule, his new gym membership, his sudden interest in updating his wardrobe, all took on sinister new meaning. He'd claimed the travel was necessary for client development, the gym membership was about getting healthier, the clothes were about projecting success for the company. I had supported all of it, even encouraged some of it, because I wanted David to be happy and successful. What kind of woman did that make me? The question gnawed at me as the first hints of dawn began filtering through our bedroom's panoramic windows. Had I been willfully blind or genuinely deceived? Did it matter? The result was the same. I'd been living a lie for an unknown amount of time, making decisions based on false information, planning a future with someone who'd already checked out of our marriage. David's breathing had settled into the deep rhythm of sleep, and I found myself studying his face in the growing light. When had he stopped looking at me the way he used to? When had our conversations become purely logistical, focused on schedules and household management, rather than dreams and ideas? When had we stopped being lovers and become merely efficient roommates managing a shared domestic enterprise? The questions multiplied, but underneath them all was a growing certainty that felt both devastating and liberating. This marriage was over. Maybe it had been over for longer than I'd realized. Maintained through momentum and habit rather than genuine connection. The text message from Ashley wasn't the beginning of the end. It was simply the moment I'd been forced to acknowledge what had already happened. But acknowledging the end and deciding what to do about it were entirely different challenges. I could confront David immediately, demand explanations and apologies, insist on counseling and transparency, and all the traditional steps people took when trying to rebuild after infidelity. I could pretend I'd never seen Ashley's message and live in willful ignorance, hoping the affair would burn itself out naturally. Or I could do something else entirely, something that honored the woman I'd been before David, and anticipated the woman I might become after him. As the sun crested the hills across the lake, painting our bedroom in warm golden light, I made a decision that would have seemed impossible just hours earlier. I wasn't going to save this marriage. I wasn't going to fight for David, or compete with Ashley, or beg for another chance to be the wife he apparently didn't want. Instead, I was going to save myself. I was going to remember who Jessica Martinez had been before she'd become Mrs. David Martinez. And I was going to build something better from the ruins of this beautiful, terrible life we'd created together. The plan began forming immediately, my strategic mind already working through logistics and timelines. David would never see it coming, because he'd fundamentally underestimated the woman he'd married. He'd confused my support for weakness, my compromise for submission, my love for dependency. It was a mistake that would cost him everything he thought he'd successfully hidden from me. I slipped out of bed carefully, leaving David to his satisfied sleep, and walked to the kitchen to make coffee. Our house felt different already, less like a home and more like a beautiful prison. I'd finally found the key to escape. The coffee maker hummed quietly as I stood at our kitchen island, the same place Ashley had sat just 2 months ago at our anniversary party, toasting to 8 years of marriage while secretly texting my husband. The irony was perfect, really. Ashley thought she knew something about David that I didn't, thought she was winning some competition I didn't even know we were having. What she didn't understand was that she was welcome to the prize. By the time I was finished, David Martinez would be exactly the kind of man Ashley Chen deserved. Diminished, exposed, and completely unprepared for the consequences of his choices. I opened my laptop and began to research divorce attorneys in Austin, starting with the most aggressive and successful practitioners in the city. If David wanted to play games with people's lives, he was about to discover that his wife was a much better strategist than he'd ever imagined. The woman who'd rebuilt failing companies was about to rebuild her own life, and this time she wasn't going to compromise on her vision of what success looked like. The morning routine proceeded exactly as it had for the past 8 years, with one crucial difference. I was no longer performing it unconsciously. Every action felt deliberate, purposeful, as if I was documenting evidence of the life I'd built while David systematically dismantled our marriage behind my back. I prepared his favorite breakfast, steel-cut oats with fresh berries, and a drizzle of local honey, the same meal I'd perfected during our 2nd year of marriage, when he'd mentioned wanting to eat healthier. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was still taking care of him even after discovering his betrayal. David emerged from our bedroom at exactly 7:15, showered and dressed in the charcoal suit I'd helped him select at Nordstrom 6 months ago. He looked polished, successful, every inch the rising tech executive who commanded respect in Austin's competitive business landscape. What he didn't look like was a man consumed by guilt or anxiety about maintaining a double life. His comfort with deception was perhaps the most unsettling discovery of all. "You're up early," he commented, accepting the coffee I handed him with the same casual gratitude he'd shown for years. "Did you sleep okay after all?" The question carried no real concern, just the surface-level politeness of two people sharing space. When had our communication devolved to this? When had we stopped actually seeing each other and started simply going through motions? I watched him check his phone, the same device that had revealed his affair, and wondered how many messages from Ashley he was reading while I stood 3 feet away. "Just had some things on my mind," I replied, maintaining the easy tone that had gotten me through countless mornings when I'd felt disconnected from him but couldn't articulate why. "Early client call today." This was true, though not the whole truth. Martinez Associates had landed a significant account the previous month, a struggling food truck empire that needed complete brand repositioning. The owner, Maria Santos, had built her business from a single truck to 12 locations, before a social media scandal had nearly destroyed everything she'd worked for. The project was exactly the kind of challenge I thrived on, requiring creative strategy and meticulous execution to rebuild public trust. What David didn't know was that this project had awakened something in me that had been dormant for too long. Working with Maria had reminded me of my own entrepreneurial instincts, the vision I'd had when I'd first started in marketing of building something entirely my own. Before David, before the compromise and accommodation that had gradually eroded my professional ambitions, I'd dreamed of starting my own agency. Life with David had made that dream seem unrealistic, even selfish, when we had a mortgage and shared financial goals that required steady income rather than entrepreneurial risk. Now, watching my husband scroll through what were probably messages from his mistress while eating the breakfast I'd prepared, those old dreams felt not just possible, but necessary. I had the skills, the reputation, and the connections to build something significant. What I'd lacked was the motivation to disrupt our comfortable life. Ashley Chen had just provided that motivation in the most devastating way possible. David finished his breakfast with the efficient speed of someone whose mind was already at the office, or perhaps on someone at the office. He kissed my cheek with the same perfunctory affection he'd shown for the past 2 years, a gesture that had once meant something, but had devolved into mere habit. The kiss felt like a lie against my skin. Another small violation in what I was beginning to understand was a pattern of disrespect so gradual, I'd barely noticed it happening. "Late night tonight," he mentioned, gathering his laptop bag and keys. "Steve and I are meeting with potential investors for the expansion. Might not be home until after 10. Another lie, delivered with the smooth confidence of someone who'd had plenty of practice. I wondered if Ashley would be at this fictional investor meeting, or if they'd found some other location for their romantic encounters. The detail felt important somehow, though I couldn't yet articulate why. Perhaps it was simply that understanding the scope of his deception would help me plan my response more effectively. "Good luck with the presentation," I said, because that's what the old Jessica would have said. The supportive wife who celebrated his victories and commiserated with his setbacks, who'd reorganized her own schedule countless times to accommodate his career demands. "I'll probably work late too. The Santos account needs the new brand guidelines finalized by Friday." David nodded absently, already mentally elsewhere. His departure felt like a release, the house finally exhaling after holding its breath through another morning of elaborate pretense. I stood at our kitchen window, watching his Tesla disappear down Lakeside Drive, and felt something close to relief that the performance was over. The house around me felt different in the growing morning light, less like the dream home we'd created together, and more like a beautiful monument to my own misplaced priorities. Every carefully chosen piece of furniture, every thoughtfully curated art piece, every detail I'd spent hours perfecting, suddenly seemed like evidence of how completely I'd lost myself in the project of being David's wife. When had my own aesthetic become secondary to creating the perfect backdrop for our entertaining? When had I stopped choosing things because I loved them and started choosing them because they impressed other people? The realization was both humbling and infuriating. I'd been so focused on building the external trappings of success that I'd ignored the growing emptiness at the center of it all. Our marriage had become a performance piece, beautiful from the outside but hollow at its core. David's affair wasn't an aberration. It was the logical conclusion of a relationship that had prioritized appearance over authenticity for far too long. I walked through our house with new eyes, mentally cataloging not just the financial value of our shared possessions but their emotional significance. The dining room table, where we'd hosted dozens of dinner parties but rarely shared intimate conversations. The living room furniture arranged for optimal entertaining, but not for the kind of comfortable daily life that nurtures real connection. The master bedroom suite that looked like a magazine spread but had become more like a hotel room we both happened to sleep in. Even our wedding photos, artfully displayed throughout the house, felt like artifacts from someone else's life. The young woman in those pictures looked genuinely happy, genuinely in love, genuinely convinced she was building something lasting with the man beside her. I envied her innocence even as I mourned her naivete. She'd had no idea that her willingness to compromise would gradually erode into complete self-abandonment. The transition had been so gradual, so seemingly reasonable, that I'd never recognized it as a threat. When David's career demanded more of his time and attention, I'd been understanding. When his social obligations expanded, I'd been supportive. When his income began to significantly exceed mine, I'd been practical about whose career should take priority during conflicts. Each individual decision had seemed minor, even wise, but their cumulative effect had been to slowly erase my own professional identity in favor of being David's accomplished wife. The irony was that my marketing expertise should have made me more aware of how effectively I was being rebranded. I'd spent years helping companies understand their core values and ensure their external messaging aligned with their authentic identity. Yet I'd somehow failed to notice that my own brand had been completely subsumed by David's vision of what our marriage should look like. My phone rang, interrupting this uncomfortable self-examination. Monica Williams, my closest friend since graduate school, calling from her law office downtown. Monica had always been the more ambitious one in our friendship, the one who'd refused to compromise her career goals for any relationship. I'd sometimes envied her independence, even as I'd pitied what I'd seen as her inability to prioritize love over professional success. Now I wondered if she'd simply been wiser about protecting herself from the kind of gradual erosion I'd experienced. "Morning, superstar." Monica's voice carried its usual energy and warmth. "How's the Santa's project coming along? Still think you can turn that disaster around?" "Actually, yes," I replied, settling onto our living room sofa with a clarity that surprised me. "I think it's going to be one of my best campaigns yet. There's something powerful about helping someone rebuild after they've lost everything." "You sound different," Monica observed with the perception that made her an excellent attorney. "More focused than you've been in months. Everything okay at home?" The question hung in the air, loaded with implications I wasn't ready to address. Monica had never been David's biggest fan, though she'd been diplomatically supportive of our marriage. She'd occasionally made comments about how much I'd changed since marrying him, observations I'd dismissed as jealousy or misunderstanding. Now I wondered if she'd seen something I'd been too close to recognize. "Home is complicated," I admitted, testing the words carefully. "David and I are going through some changes." "What kind of changes?" Monica's attorney instincts kicked in immediately. "Jessica, if something's wrong, you know you can talk to me. Whatever it is." The offer was tempting, but I wasn't ready to reveal the full scope of what I'd discovered. Not yet. I needed to understand my options before I started making public declarations about David's infidelity. Once I told Monica, the information would feel more real, more permanent. I wasn't quite prepared for that level of commitment to this new reality. "Just relationship stuff," I deflected. "We're both so busy with work, you know how it is. Sometimes you look up and realize you've been living parallel lives instead of a shared one." This was true, even if it wasn't the complete truth. Monica seemed to accept it, though I suspected she heard the things I wasn't saying. She'd always been protective of me, sometimes to a degree that made David uncomfortable. He'd never explicitly asked me to limit my friendship with Monica, but he'd made enough subtle comments about her negative influence that I'd gradually reduced the time we spent together. Another small accommodation that suddenly seemed significant. "You should come to lunch this week," Monica suggested. "Just the two of us. We haven't had a real conversation in forever, and I miss my best friend." The invitation felt like a lifeline, a connection to the person I'd been before I'd gotten so lost in being Mrs. David Martinez. Monica represented continuity, a relationship that predated my marriage and wasn't defined by it. Talking to her might help me remember who Jessica Martinez had been when she was just herself. I'd love that, I said, meaning it completely. Let me check my schedule and text you some options. After we hung up, I realized I'd committed to taking a step that would make this crisis more real. Telling Monica would require articulating what had happened, making it concrete in a way that thinking about it privately hadn't achieved. It would also mean admitting that my marriage, the relationship everyone in our social circle admired and envied, was built on foundations far more fragile than anyone had realized. The morning stretched ahead of me, filled with client calls and strategy sessions that suddenly felt like preparation for a much larger campaign than DeSantis' account. I was beginning to understand that rebuilding Maria's food truck empire might be practice for rebuilding my own life. The skills were similar: assess the damage, identify the core strengths that remained intact, develop a comprehensive strategy for moving forward, and execute with precision and confidence. The difference was that this time, I wouldn't be saving someone else's vision. I'd be creating my own. Part 3, the hidden betrayal DeSantis client call, went better than expected, though I found myself operating with a clarity and focus I hadn't experienced in months. Perhaps discovering your husband's affair provides a certain perspective on what actually constitutes a real crisis versus mere business challenges. Maria Santos was dealing with public relations damage that threatened her livelihood. I was dealing with personal betrayal that threatened my entire sense of self. The comparison made her problems feel both more manageable and more urgent. The new messaging strategy is brilliant, Maria said through the video conference, her enthusiasm evident despite the early hour. This approach of owning the mistake while pivoting to our community commitment, it feels authentic because it is authentic. My customers will see that. I smiled at her confidence, remembering my own conviction about authentic messaging versus manufactured image management. How ironic that I'd become an expert at helping others present their genuine selves to the world while losing sight of my own authenticity entirely. The work felt meaningful in a way that transcended the professional satisfaction I'd expected. Authenticity is everything, I agreed, the words carrying weight I hadn't intended. People can sense when you're trying to be something you're not, and they respond to genuine transformation more than perfect presentation. After the call ended, I sat in my home office, a converted bedroom that had become my sanctuary over the past few years. David rarely entered this space, claiming it was too cluttered for his minimalist preferences. In reality, the organized chaos of marketing materials, client files, and inspiration boards represented something entirely my own in a house that had gradually become a showcase for our shared image rather than individual personalities. This room held reminders of campaigns I'd managed independently, successes that belonged entirely to me rather than to us as a couple. The wall displayed awards I'd won for innovative strategies, photographs from client events where I'd been the featured expert, and thank you notes from business owners whose companies I'd helped resurrect. Looking at these achievements, I wondered when I'd started downplaying them in conversations with David, when I'd begun presenting my professional victories as modest contributions to our household success, rather than significant accomplishments in their own right. The shift had been subtle but persistent. David's natural tendency to dominate conversations, combined with his impressive technical expertise and expanding business success, had gradually pushed my professional identity into the background of our social interactions. At dinner parties, I'd become known more for my hosting skills and my ability to facilitate interesting conversations than for my strategic marketing expertise. People knew I worked in marketing, but they were more likely to discuss David's latest technological innovations or business expansion plans. I'd convinced myself this was simply natural, that couples didn't need to compete for attention or recognition. But now I recognized it as another form of erasure, a slow diminishment of my professional identity that had paralleled the erosion of my personal autonomy. When had I stopped introducing myself by my job title and started introducing myself as David's wife who happened to work in marketing? When had my achievements become anecdotes that supported his success story rather than narratives worth exploring for their own merit? My phone buzzed with a text from David, probably between meetings at TechFlow. Hope your client call went well. See you tonight. The message was perfectly normal, the kind of supportive communication any wife might expect from her husband during a busy workday. The normalcy of it felt surreal, given what I knew about his secret communications with Ashley. How many times had he texted me these casual updates while simultaneously carrying on intimate conversations with her? The duplicity was staggering. I found myself studying the message for clues, analyzing the tone and timing the way I might examine a competitor's marketing campaign for weaknesses. Was "see you tonight" confirmation that he wouldn't be with Ashley today? Or simply another lie designed to maintain his cover? Did "hope your client call went well" represent genuine interest in my work? Or was it the kind of perfunctory spouse maintenance he performed between more exciting activities? The uncertainty was almost worse than the knowledge of his affair. At least Ashley's text had been unambiguously clear about her intentions and their relationship. David's messages existed in a gray area where every word could be interpreted multiple ways, where apparent caring might mask complete indifference. I was married to someone whose communications required the same careful analysis I applied to deceptive corporate messaging. Around noon, I decided to drive to the Hill Country Club for lunch, ostensibly to work in a different environment, but actually to conduct reconnaissance. David played tennis there most Saturday mornings, and several TechFlow events had been held in their private dining rooms. If he was conducting an affair with a colleague, the club represented the kind of neutral territory where they might feel comfortable meeting without arousing suspicion from mutual acquaintances. The club's dining room was moderately busy, with the usual mix of local professionals and wealthy retirees who treated lunch as a social occasion rather than mere sustenance. I chose a corner table with good sightlines to the entrance and ordered a salad I had no intention of eating. The surveillance felt both necessary and absurd, like playing detective in my own marriage. 20 minutes into my observation, Ashley Chen walked through the dining room entrance, and my heart rate immediately accelerated. She looked exactly as I remembered from our anniversary party, professionally polished, confident, younger than me in a way that seemed effortless rather than calculated. She was alone, checking her phone with the focused attention of someone expecting an important message. Everything about her body language suggested she was meeting someone rather than dining solo. I watched her scan the room briefly before taking a table near the windows, positioning herself with a clear view of the entrance. Her choice of seating felt strategic, the behavior of someone accustomed to clandestine meetings. She ordered quickly when the server approached, again suggesting this was a business transaction rather than a leisurely meal. Every detail supported my growing suspicion that David's affair was conducted with the same systematic approach he applied to his professional life. Ashley checked her phone 3 times in the first 10 minutes, her expression growing slightly impatient. Was David running late for their lunch date? Had he canceled to maintain the pretense of investor meetings? I found myself invested in their logistics in a way that felt both voyeuristic and necessary. Understanding the mechanics of their relationship might provide insights into how long it had been going on, and how sophisticated their deception had become. My phone buzzed with another message from David. Investor meeting moved to 2 p.m. Grabbing quick lunch at the club before heading back to office. The timing was perfect, confirming that David was indeed meeting Ashley while simultaneously providing me with cover story he'd use if anyone mentioned seeing him there. The casual efficiency of his lie was both impressive and disgusting. I paid my check quickly and moved to the club's library, a quiet room adjacent to the dining area that offered partial views of the restaurant through decorative glass panels. From this position, I could observe their interaction without being easily noticed. The setup felt like something from a movie, except the stakes were my actual life rather than entertainment. David arrived 15 minutes later, moving through the dining room with the easy confidence of someone who belonged there. His greeting with Ashley was professionally appropriate, but carried an undercurrent of intimacy that was unmistakable once you knew to look for it. The way his hand lingered on her shoulder as he sat down, the way she smiled at something he said before he'd even reached the table, the way they both leaned slightly forward in their chairs, all suggested a relationship that extended far beyond workplace collaboration. Watching them together was like seeing David with a different personality, more animated and engaged than he'd been with me in months. He laughed at her comments, asked follow-up questions, maintained the kind of focused attention he hadn't shown me since our early dating years. The contrast was devastating, not because I was jealous of Ashley specifically, but because it confirmed how completely David had checked out of our marriage while maintaining the facade of business as usual. Their conversation lasted exactly 45 minutes, ending with what appeared to be reluctant agreement to return to their respective obligations. David picked up the check, a gesture that could be interpreted as professional courtesy or personal gallantry depending on your perspective. They left separately, with Ashley departing first and David following 5 minutes later, another small detail that suggested practiced discretion. I remained in the library for another 10 minutes, processing what I'd witnessed and its implications for my understanding of their relationship. This wasn't a recent development or an impulsive attraction that had gotten out of hand. The comfort level between them, the seamless coordination of their meeting, the natural intimacy of their interaction, all pointed to an affair that had been developing over months, possibly longer. The systematic nature of their deception was perhaps the most insulting aspect of the entire situation. David hadn't been swept away by passion or temporary madness. He'd been deliberately and methodically building a parallel relationship while maintaining our marriage as cover. Every family event Ashley had attended, every professional milestone she'd witnessed, every personal detail about our life that David had presumably shared with her, all of it represented calculated betrayal rather than emotional confusion. Driving home, I felt something shift in my understanding of what needed to happen next. This wasn't a crisis that could be resolved through better communication or marriage counseling or recommitment to our relationship. This was a fundamental incompatibility between who David actually was and who I'd believed him to be. The man I'd married wouldn't have been capable of this level of sustained deception. The man I'd married had apparently never existed at all. The realization was liberating in an unexpected way. I'd been trying to fix something that had been broken from the beginning, working to improve a relationship with someone who'd been lying about his basic character. The failure wasn't mine. It was his. My only mistake had been trusting someone who'd proven himself unworthy of trust. That evening, David returned home at exactly the time he'd predicted, carrying Chinese takeout from our favorite restaurant and the slightly tired but satisfied expression of someone who'd had a productive day. His performance was flawless, down to asking about my client calls and sharing carefully edited highlights from his investor meetings. If I hadn't witnessed his lunch with Ashley, I would have had no reason to doubt any of it. "How did the meeting go?" I asked, genuinely curious about how he'd construct this particular fiction. "Really well," David replied, settling onto our living room sofa with his dinner. "Steve thinks we'll get approval for the expansion within the next month." The investors were impressed with our growth projections, especially the automation software integration we've been developing. Every word was probably true, just delivered 6 hours later than the actual events. David's talent for selective truth-telling was remarkable. He could provide accurate information while completely misrepresenting the context. I wondered if this skill had developed specifically for managing his affair, or if it was a character trait I'd simply never noticed before. "That's wonderful," I replied, because that's what the old Jessica would have said. "I'm proud of how hard you've worked for this." And part of me was proud, even while recognizing the absurdity of maintaining normal conversation with someone who'd been systematically betraying me. David had built something impressive with TechFlow, and his professional achievements deserved recognition regardless of his personal failures. The complexity of my emotions surprised me. Apparently, it was possible to simultaneously feel pride, anger, disappointment, and determination without any of them canceling out the others. That night, as David slept peacefully beside me, I lay awake planning my next moves with the same strategic thinking I applied to challenging marketing campaigns. Phase 1 had been information gathering, understanding the scope and nature of the problem. Phase 2 would be resource assessment, determining what assets and advantages I possessed for the confrontation ahead. Phase 3 would be strategic implementation, executing my plan with precision and confidence. David had made the crucial mistake of underestimating his opponent. He'd confused my willingness to accommodate with inability to compete, my preference for harmony with acceptance of disrespect. Tomorrow, I would begin demonstrating the difference between choosing to be understanding and being forced to be strategic. The woman who'd rebuilt failing companies was about to rebuild her own life, and this time, she wouldn't be compromising on her vision of what success looked like. Part 4. The strategic assessment. The next morning brought unexpected clarity, as if discovering the full extent of David's betrayal had burned away years of accumulated confusion about our relationship. I woke before my alarm, feeling more rested than I had in weeks despite sleeping poorly. Sometimes the worst thing about a crisis is the uncertainty. Once you understand exactly what you're dealing with, the path forward becomes remarkably clear. David's routine proceeded exactly as always. Shower, coffee, perfunctory breakfast conversation, distracted departure. But I observed it all with new eyes, noting details that had previously escaped my attention. The way he checked his phone constantly, even during our brief morning interaction. The extra care he took with his appearance, styling his hair with more precision than necessary for a day of internal meetings. The subtle restlessness that suggested his mind was already elsewhere, probably on Ashley and whatever plans they'd made for the day. "Working late again tonight," he mentioned while gathering his laptop bag. "We're finalizing the investor contracts, so it might be another 10 o'clock finish." Another lie, delivered with the same casual confidence as yesterday's fiction. I wondered if Ashley was part of tonight's fabricated work session, or if David was simply creating general cover for future activities. Either way, his comfort with deception was becoming clearer with each interaction. This wasn't someone struggling with guilt or torn between competing loyalties. This was someone who'd compartmentalized his life so completely that lying to his wife required no more effort than reading the weather forecast. "Of course," I replied, maintaining the supportive tone that had enabled his deception for months. "I'll probably work late too. The Santa's campaign is reaching its critical phase." This was actually true, though I'd begun to see DeSantis' project as practice for a much more personal campaign. Helping Maria rebuild her business reputation after a scandal required the same skills I'd need for rebuilding my own life after David's betrayal: honest assessment of damage, strategic communication planning, and systematic execution of a recovery plan. The professional challenge was becoming a template for personal transformation. After David left, I called in sick to my office and spent the morning conducting what amounted to a comprehensive audit of my marriage. Not the emotional archaeology of trying to understand where things had gone wrong, but the practical inventory of assets, liabilities, and leverage points that would determine my options going forward. If David wanted to treat our relationship as a business transaction, I'd respond with appropriate professional detachment. Our financial situation was more complex than I'd realized, partially because I had allowed David to manage most of our shared accounts and investments. This had seemed practical when his business background made him better qualified for financial planning, but now I recognized it as another form of gradual disempowerment. I'd maintained my own checking and business accounts, but our major assets were structured in ways that gave David primary control. The house was jointly owned, but David had handled the mortgage paperwork and tax filings. Our investment portfolio was managed through his financial advisor at a firm where David's business connections had secured better rates and service. Even our car insurance and health benefits were organized around his employment and preferences. Piece by piece, our shared life had been structured to maximize his control and minimize my independent options. But I wasn't as powerless as this arrangement might suggest. My marketing consultancy generated substantial income that I'd been depositing into our joint account, while maintaining minimal personal savings. This had felt like the partnership approach when we were both committed to shared goals. Now it represented money I'd essentially been giving to David while he used our shared resources to finance his affair. The realization was both infuriating and motivating. I spent the afternoon photographing important documents, transferring files to secure cloud storage, and creating detailed records of our shared assets and individual contributions. This wasn't preparation for immediate confrontation, but for strategic positioning when the confrontation became inevitable. Every successful campaign required thorough research and careful documentation before moving into active phases. The house felt different as I moved through it with this new purpose: less like a home and more like a crime scene where evidence needed to be preserved. Each room held reminders of joint decisions and shared investments that now carried different meanings. The custom kitchen renovation we'd completed 2 years ago, funded primarily by my Santos-sized client successes. The home office setup that had been designed around David's preferences while my workspace was relegated to a converted bedroom. The entertainment system and luxury furnishings that reflected his tastes more than mine. I'd contributed significantly to creating this beautiful life, but it had been structured around David's vision of what success should look like. How many times had I deferred to his preferences on major purchases, decorating decisions, or lifestyle choices? How often had I convinced myself that compromise meant accepting his priorities over my own? The pattern was clear once I stopped making excuses for it. I'd been systematically erasing my own preferences in favor of maintaining harmony with someone who wasn't extending the same consideration to me. My phone rang around 3 o'clock, Monica's name appearing on the screen like a lifeline. I'd been thinking about our conversation from the day before, about her invitation to lunch, and her perceptive observation that I sounded different. Maybe it was time to start reaching out to people who remembered who I'd been before I'd gotten so lost in being David's wife. "Please tell me you're free for lunch tomorrow," Monica said without preamble. "I've been thinking about our conversation yesterday, and I have a feeling there's more going on than you're ready to discuss yet." Her directness was both comforting and terrifying. Monica had always been the friend who saw through surface explanations to underlying truths, which had made her an excellent attorney and sometimes an uncomfortable companion. But right now, I needed someone who wouldn't accept polite deflections, someone who would push me to articulate what I was really dealing with. "Lunch sounds perfect," I replied. "And you're right, there are some things I need to talk through with someone I trust." "I knew it," Monica said with satisfaction. "David problems?" The question was simple, but answering it would make this crisis more real than it had been while I was processing it privately. Once I told Monica about Ashley's text and David's affair, I'd be committed to treating this as an actual emergency rather than something I might somehow overlook or forgive. The prospect was both scary and necessary. "Among other things," I admitted carefully. "It's complicated, but yeah, David is definitely part of the problem." "Bastard," Monica said with immediate loyalty. "I never trusted his whole perfect husband act. Too polished, like he was always performing instead of just being himself." Her observation was surprisingly accurate. David had always been careful about his image, particularly in social situations where my friends were involved. He'd seemed to understand that Monica in particular was evaluating him critically, and he'd responded by being almost aggressively charming and attentive to me when she was around. I'd interpreted this as him making an effort to win over my best friend. Now I wondered if it was simply another performance, designed to maintain the facade of our perfect marriage for the audience that mattered most to me. "We'll talk about it tomorrow," I said, not quite ready to dive into the full story over the phone. "But Monica, what do you know about divorce attorneys in Austin?" Hypothetically speaking. The silence on the other end lasted long enough for me to wonder if the call had dropped. When Monica spoke again, her voice had shifted into full attorney mode, professional, and focused in a way that told me she understood the seriousness of what I was asking. "Hypothetically, there are several excellent options depending on what kind of approach you want to take," she said carefully. "Are we talking about amicable dissolution with fair asset division, or are we talking about warfare with someone who's been hiding things and needs to be held accountable?" The question forced me to confront something I hadn't fully acknowledged yet. What kind of divorce did I want? The old Jessica, the one who'd spent 8 years avoiding conflict and maintaining harmony, might have chosen the amicable approach even after discovering adultery. But the woman I was becoming, the one who'd been systematically underestimated and disrespected, felt drawn to the accountability option. "Probably somewhere in between," I said finally. "I want to be fair, but I also want to make sure I'm protected, and that there are consequences for bad behavior." "Smart approach," Monica approved. "I'll email you some names and information tonight." "And Jessica? Whatever's going on, you don't have to handle it alone. I'm here for whatever you need." Her support felt like the first genuinely unconditional offer I'd received in months. David's care had always come with implicit expectations and conditions. His affection was tied to my performance as the perfect wife. His attention was contingent on my willingness to prioritize his needs over my own. Monica's friendship had no agenda beyond wanting me to be happy and successful on my own terms. That evening, I prepared dinner with unusual attention to detail, though not for David's benefit. This was likely one of the last meals I'd cook in this kitchen as his wife, one of the final performances of domestic harmony before everything changed. The ritual felt important somehow, a way of honoring what our marriage had been before it became what it was now. David arrived home at exactly 10:15, carrying the satisfied exhaustion of someone who'd had a productive day. He accepted the plate I'd prepared with grateful surprise, commenting on how thoughtful I was to wait dinner for him despite his late arrival. The appreciation seemed genuine, which made his deception feel even more insulting. He was capable of noticing and valuing my efforts. He simply chose to direct his primary attention elsewhere. "The investor meeting went even better than expected," he said, settling into our dining room with the expensive wine I'd opened for the occasion. "Steve thinks we'll close the deal within 2 weeks. This could transform the whole company." His enthusiasm was infectious, and I found myself genuinely interested in his business success despite everything else. David had built something impressive with TechFlow, and his professional achievements deserved recognition, regardless of his personal failures. The complexity of my feelings continued to surprise me. Apparently, love and respect and anger and disappointment could coexist without any of them diminishing the others. "That's incredible," I replied, raising my glass in a toast. "You've worked so hard for this opportunity." We clinked glasses across our beautiful dining room table, surrounded by the life we'd built together, and for a moment it felt like the marriage we'd once had. David relaxed in a way I hadn't seen in months, talking animatedly about his plans for expansion and the technical innovations that would set TechFlow apart from competitors. He was brilliant when he talked about his work, passionate and strategic, and completely engaged in a way that reminded me why I'd fallen in love with him. The disconnect was devastating. This version of David, enthusiastic and present and genuinely connected to our conversation, still existed. He simply chose to reserve it for his professional life and his affair with Ashley, leaving me with the distracted, performative version who went through the motions of marriage without investing any real energy in it. After dinner, David retreated to his laptop for what he claimed was follow-up work from the day's meetings. I cleaned the kitchen methodically, filing away the memory of this last normal evening before everything changed. Tomorrow I'd have lunch with Monica and begin the process of building a support system for whatever came next. This weekend, I'd start looking at apartments and developing concrete plans for independent living. By next week, I'd be ready to confront David with evidence of his affair and demands for how we'd handle the dissolution of our marriage. But tonight, I allowed myself to mourn the marriage I'd thought we had, the partnership I'd believed we were building, the future I'd planned that would never exist. The grief was real, even though the relationship had been largely fictional. I'd invested 8 years of genuine love and effort into something that had apparently meant far less to David than it had to me. That deserved acknowledgement, even if only privately. Standing in our kitchen, surrounded by the beautiful life that was about to implode, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. Excitement about my own future. Not the future we'd planned together, but the future I'd choose for myself. For the first time since discovering Ashley's text, I was looking forward rather than backward. Planning rather than just reacting. The woman who'd rebuilt failing companies was about to rebuild her own life. And this time, she wouldn't be compromising her vision to accommodate someone else's agenda. Part 5, the alliance formation. The next morning, I woke with the kind of determined energy I hadn't felt since the early days of building my marketing consultancy. There's something clarifying about having a concrete plan, even when that plan involves dismantling the life you've spent years creating. I dressed carefully for my lunch with Monica, choosing the navy blazer and designer jeans that made me feel both professional and approachable, the outfit of someone who was in control rather than falling apart. David left for work with his usual distracted efficiency, mentioning another late meeting that would keep him away until nearly midnight. The pattern was becoming so predictable it almost seemed like parody, but I no longer felt frustrated by his transparent lies. Instead, they provided useful information about his schedule and priorities, data I could use for planning my own activities without interference. Cafe Luna occupied a converted warehouse in downtown Austin, all exposed brick and industrial lighting that somehow managed to feel both sophisticated and comfortable. Monica had chosen our table carefully, tucked into a corner where we could speak privately without being overheard by the usual mix of tech workers and creative professionals who frequented the place during lunch hours. She was already waiting when I arrived, studying her phone with the focused intensity she brought to everything. "You look different," Monica observed as I settled into the chair across from her. "More alert, maybe? Like you've been sleeping better." The comment was ironic, given how little I'd actually slept since discovering Ashley's text, but I understood what she meant. The constant low-level anxiety that had plagued me for months had been replaced by something sharper and more purposeful. Knowing what I was dealing with, even when it was devastating, felt better than the vague sense that something was wrong without being able to identify exactly what. "I've had some clarity recently about certain situations in my life," I replied carefully, still not quite ready to dive into the full story. "It's amazing how much energy you waste when you're trying to ignore obvious problems." Monica's expression sharpened with interest. She'd been my closest friend since graduate school, which meant she'd witnessed my entire relationship with David from its promising beginning to its current dismal state. More importantly, she'd never been particularly impressed by David's charm or convinced by our apparent marital happiness. Her skepticism had sometimes irritated me, but now I wondered if she'd simply been more perceptive than I'd wanted to acknowledge. "David problems?" she asked directly, the same question she'd posed during our phone conversation. This time I was ready to answer honestly. "David is having an affair," I said, the words coming out more calmly than I'd expected. "With Ashley Chen, someone from his office. I discovered it through text messages he received while I was in the room." Monica's reaction was immediate and multifaceted. Anger on my behalf, satisfaction at having her suspicions confirmed, and professional concern about the implications. Her face cycled through these emotions rapidly, before settling into the focused attention she gave to complex legal problems that required strategic solutions. "How explicit were the messages?" she asked, her attorney instincts kicking in immediately. "And how long do you think this has been going on?" I described Ashley's text in detail, along with my subsequent surveillance at the Hill Country Club, and my growing understanding of how systematically David had been lying about his schedule and activities. Monica listened without interruption, occasionally taking notes on her phone in the shorthand she used for case preparation. Watching her treat my personal crisis with professional seriousness was both comforting and surreal. "This isn't a recent development," Monica concluded when I finished my account. "The comfort level you described, the practiced coordination of their meeting, the sophisticated deception about his schedule, all of that suggests a relationship that's been developing for months, maybe longer." Her assessment matched my own conclusions, but hearing it confirmed by someone with extensive experience in divorce proceedings made the reality feel more concrete. This wasn't a marriage that could be saved through better communication or renewed commitment. This was a fundamental betrayal that had been sustained over time through deliberate deception. "The question is what you want to do about it," Monica continued, her tone shifting from analysis to advocacy. "Are you looking for ways to repair the marriage? Or are you ready to move towards separation and divorce?" The directness of the question forced me to confront something I'd been avoiding even in my own thoughts. Despite all the evidence of David's betrayal, despite my growing anger and determination to protect myself, some part of me was still holding on to the possibility that this could be fixed. Not because I believed David deserved another chance, but because admitting the marriage was over felt like acknowledging that I'd wasted 8 years of my life on someone who'd never valued me appropriately. "I don't think it can be repaired," I said slowly, testing the words to see how they felt. Not because of the affair itself, but because of what the affair reveals about who David actually is. Someone who could maintain this level of deception for months isn't someone I can trust, regardless of what he promises about future behavior. Monica nodded approvingly. "That's a mature and realistic assessment. A lot of people get stuck trying to save relationships that were fundamentally damaged long before the crisis that exposed the problems." Her validation felt important, in a way I hadn't anticipated. Monica's opinion carried weight because she'd known both David and me throughout our entire relationship. If she thought my assessment was reasonable rather than reactionary, it suggested I was thinking clearly, despite the emotional turbulence of the situation. So what are my options? I asked, ready to shift from analysis to action planning. Monica pulled out a leather portfolio and began sketching what amounted to a strategic framework for divorce proceedings. First, we need to understand your financial position and legal rights. Texas is a community property state, which means assets acquired during marriage are generally divided equally regardless of who earned them or whose name they're in. This was better news than I'd expected. My tendency to defer to David's financial management had left me unclear about our exact asset value, but I knew we'd accumulated significant wealth during our marriage. Between the house, David's business equity, our investment portfolio, and my own business assets, there was substantial value to divide. However, Monica continued, adultery can impact property division in certain circumstances, particularly if marital assets were used to support the affair. Hotel rooms, expensive dinners, gifts for the other woman, that kind of thing can be recovered from the guilty party's share of the community property. The possibility of holding David financially accountable for his infidelity felt satisfying in a way I hadn't expected. This wasn't about revenge exactly, but about ensuring there were concrete consequences for his choices. If he'd been spending our shared money on Ashley, that represented theft from our marriage that should be addressed in the settlement. What about spousal support? I asked, though I wasn't sure I'd want or need ongoing financial connection to David. Unlikely to be significant given your own income and career prospects, Monica replied. But if David's affair caused you professional damage, or if you need time to rebuild your independent practice, there might be arguments for temporary support while you transition. The mention of rebuilding my practice sparked something I hadn't fully articulated yet. For years, I'd been working for Martinez Associates while dreaming of starting my own agency. My marriage to David had made that dream seem impractical, even selfish, when we had shared financial goals that required steady income rather than entrepreneurial risk. But if I was going to be rebuilding my life anyway, why not rebuild it around my own vision rather than someone else's expectations? Actually, I've been thinking about leaving Martinez Associates and starting my own marketing firm, I admitted. I have the client relationships and reputation to make it work, and the Santa's campaign is exactly the kind of high-profile success that could launch an independent practice. Monica's face lit up with excitement. That's brilliant, and perfect timing strategically. If you're going to be financially independent anyway, you might as well be doing work that's entirely your own. Plus, building your own business during divorce proceedings shows the court that you're taking responsibility for your own financial future, rather than depending on David indefinitely. Her enthusiasm was contagious, and I felt something that had been dormant for years begin to stir back to life. The entrepreneurial ambition that had driven me through graduate school and my early career had been gradually suppressed by the practical demands of marriage and the assumption that David's career should take priority during conflicts. Now, with our marriage ending, I could reclaim those dreams without having to justify them to someone who'd never fully supported them. I'll need startup capital, I mused, already beginning to think through the practical requirements. Office space, equipment, staff, operating expenses for at least the first year. Which brings us back to the property division, Monica pointed out. If you can document that your professional sacrifices contributed to David's business success, you might be entitled to a portion of TechFlow's value in addition to other marital assets. That could provide substantial startup funding. The idea hadn't occurred to me, but it made perfect sense. How many client dinners had I hosted for David's business contacts? How many company events had I organized or attended to support TechFlow's corporate image? How many times had I turned down professional opportunities because they conflicted with David's business obligations? All of that represented investment in his success that should be recognized in the asset division. We'll need to document everything carefully, Monica continued, shifting into full strategic planning mode. Financial records, business valuations, evidence of the affair and any related expenses, your professional contributions to David's success, the timeline of decisions that prioritized his career over yours. The scope of preparation required was daunting, but it felt manageable when broken down into specific tasks. This was the kind of systematic project management I excelled at, requiring the same skills I used for complex marketing campaigns. The difference was that this time, I was both the strategist and the client, with complete control over the objectives and timeline. How long do we have before I need to confront David? I asked, thinking about the practical timeline for gathering evidence and preparing documentation. That depends on your goals, Monica replied. If you want to maintain the element of surprise until everything is ready, you could continue gathering information for several weeks. But there are also advantages to moving quickly, particularly if you're concerned about David hiding assets or making financial moves that could disadvantage you. The possibility that David might be preparing his own strategic response hadn't occurred to me, but it made sense. If he suspected I knew about Ashley, he might be taking steps to protect himself financially or legally. The thought of him manipulating our shared assets while maintaining the pretense of normal marriage was infuriating enough to make me want to confront him immediately. Let's aim for 2 weeks, I decided. That gives me time to document everything properly and make initial plans for the business launch, but doesn't leave him too much opportunity to cause problems. Monica nodded approvingly. 2 weeks is realistic for the essential preparation. I'll draft an initial property and debt inventory for you to complete, along with a timeline of key events in your marriage that could impact the proceedings. And I'll start researching David's business structure to understand how TechFlow's value might be assessed. The conversation continued for another hour, covering practical details about temporary living arrangements, business bank accounts, and the logistics of separating our intertwined lives. By the time we finished, I had a comprehensive action plan that felt both manageable and empowering. For the first time since discovering Ashley's text, I felt like I was taking control of the situation rather than simply reacting to David's choices. One more thing, Monica said as we prepared to leave. You're going to need emotional support through this process, not just legal and strategic guidance. Divorce is traumatic even when it's necessary and justified. Don't try to handle everything alone. Her concern was touching, and it reminded me of how isolated I'd become during my marriage. David's gradual monopolization of my time and attention had resulted in weakened friendships and reduced family connections. Rebuilding those relationships would be as important as rebuilding my professional life. Actually, I was thinking about calling my sister Carmen, I said. We haven't been as close lately, but she never really liked David anyway. She might be a good ally during this process. Perfect, Monica approved. Carmen is smart and fierce, and she's never been impressed by David's charm. She'll be completely in your corner. Walking back to my car through downtown Austin's bustling streets, I felt like I was seeing the city with new eyes. This place that had been the backdrop for my marriage was about to become the setting for my independent life. The thought was both terrifying and exhilarating. I'd lived here as David's wife for 8 years. Now I'd discover what it meant to live here as simply myself. That afternoon, I called Carmen from the privacy of my home office, needing to test my ability to articulate what was happening with someone who knew me well, but wasn't professionally involved in the crisis. My sister answered on the second ring, her voice carrying the warmth and energy that had made her successful in real estate sales. Jessica, this is a nice surprise. How are you doing? How's married life treating you? The last question was loaded with irony given the timing, and I found myself laughing despite everything. Married life is about to become divorced life, actually. David's been having an affair, and I'm done pretending our marriage is something it isn't. The silence on Carmen's end lasted long enough for me to wonder if I'd been too blunt. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a mixture of satisfaction and protective anger that reminded me why I'd always felt safe with my younger sister. Finally, she said with feeling, I was wondering when you were going to wake up and realize that man never deserved you. What's the plan? Please tell me you're not going to try to work things out with him. Her immediate support was exactly what I'd needed to hear. Carmen had never been diplomatic about her feelings regarding David, though she'd restrained her criticism out of respect for my choices. Now that restraint was gone, replaced by the fierce loyalty that had characterized our relationship since childhood. The plan is divorce, starting my own marketing agency and rebuilding my life on my own terms, I replied, feeling more confident with each word. Monica's helping me with the legal strategy, and I could use your help finding a new place to live. Something downtown, maybe. closer to where I want to establish the business. I have the perfect place in mind, Carmen said immediately. A loft in the warehouse district that just came on the market. Great space for someone starting a business, and the location is perfect for networking with other entrepreneurs. When do you want to see it? Her enthusiasm was infectious, and I found myself getting excited about the practical details of building a new life. Carmen had always been the sister who took action while I overthought decisions, and her immediate readiness to help felt like exactly what I needed. This weekend, I suggested. David's supposedly working on some big project, so I'll have plenty of free time. It's a date, Carmen confirmed. And Jessica, I'm proud of you for doing this. You've been unhappy for a long time. Even if you didn't want to admit it, you deserve so much better than what David was giving you. After we hung up, I sat in my office surrounded by the evidence of my professional achievements and felt something I hadn't experienced in years. Genuine excitement about my own future. Not the future we'd planned together, but the future I'd choose for myself. The woman who'd rebuilt failing companies was about to rebuild her own life, and this time, she wouldn't be compromising her vision to accommodate someone else's agenda. That evening, David returned home at exactly the time he'd predicted, carrying Thai food from our favorite restaurant and the slightly frazzled energy of someone who'd had a demanding day. His performance was as polished as always, asking about my work and sharing carefully edited highlights from his own activities. But now I could see the calculation behind every interaction, the way he monitored my responses to ensure his stories were believable. Everything okay? He asked, settling onto our living room sofa. You seem different tonight. More relaxed, maybe. The observation was perceptive, and I realized I probably did seem different. The constant anxiety that had plagued me for months had been replaced by focused determination. Knowing what I was dealing with and having a plan for addressing it felt infinitely better than the vague sense that something was wrong without being able to identify what. Just had a good day, I replied truthfully. Sometimes everything just clicks into place, you know? David nodded, absently, already checking his phone for messages that might require immediate attention. I watched him scroll through what were probably communications from Ashley, and felt nothing but mild curiosity about their logistics. The jealousy and hurt I'd expected were absent, replaced by strategic interest in information that might be useful for divorce proceedings. Later, as we went through the evening routine that had defined our marriage for years, I found myself observing everything with anthropological detachment. This was probably one of the last times I'd prepare for bed in this house as David's wife, one of the final performances of domestic normalcy before everything changed. The ritual felt important somehow, a way of honoring what our marriage had been before it became what it was now. David fell asleep quickly, the easy rest of someone whose conscience was clear or successfully compartmentalized. I lay awake beside him, not with the anguish I'd felt just days before, but with the quiet satisfaction of someone whose plans were falling into place. 2 weeks from now, I'd be living independently and launching my own business. 2 months from now, I'd be divorced and financially secure. 2 years from now, I'd be successful enough to look back on this crisis as the best thing that had ever happened to my professional development. The thought carried me into the first peaceful sleep I'd had since discovering Ashley's text. Dreams filled not with loss and betrayal, but with possibilities and new beginnings. The downtown loft Carmen showed me that Saturday morning was perfect in ways I hadn't anticipated. Located in a converted textile warehouse, the space featured 15-foot ceilings, original hardwood floors, and massive windows that flooded the entire area with natural light. But what captured my attention immediately was the layout. An open main area perfect for a home office, a separate bedroom with privacy, and a modern kitchen island that could serve as both dining space and meeting area for client consultations. The previous tenant was a graphic designer who ran her business from here, Carmen explained, her real estate expertise evident in how she highlighted features that matched my specific needs. She had the electrical upgraded to support multiple workstations, and there's fiber internet built into the infrastructure, plus your walking distance to some of the best networking events and business meetups in the city. Standing in that sun-drenched space, I could envision exactly how it would work. My desk positioned to take advantage of the morning light, a conference area where I could meet with clients in a setting that projected both professionalism and creativity. Space for the team I'd eventually hire as the business grew. This wasn't just an apartment. It was the physical foundation for the independent life I was about to build. "I'll take it," I said without hesitation, surprising both Carmen and myself with how quickly the decision came. "What do we need to do to secure it today?" Carmen's smile was radiant with pride and excitement. "First month's rent, security deposit, and I'll expedite the application process through my contacts at the management company. You could have keys by Wednesday if everything processes smoothly." The speed felt right, matching the momentum that had been building since my conversation with Monica. Every day I delayed was another day of living the lie that had become my marriage. Another day of pretending David's deception was sustainable. The loft represented a concrete step toward the future I was choosing, tangible evidence that this transformation was really happening. While Carmen handled the paperwork, I walked through the space again, mentally arranging furniture and planning the workflow that would make this both a comfortable home and an efficient business headquarters. The main room was large enough to accommodate a proper desk setup, client seating area, and storage for marketing materials and campaign resources. The bedroom would actually feel like my own space rather than a shared territory where I had to consider someone else's preferences for everything from lighting to temperature. The financial commitment was significant but manageable. My savings from years of contributing to our joint household, while maintaining minimal personal expenses, would cover the startup costs, and my existing client relationships provided enough immediate income to support independent living while I built the new business. The numbers worked, but more importantly, the emotional calculus finally made sense. I was choosing to invest in myself rather than continuing to subsidize David's comfortable deception. That afternoon, I drove to IKEA with a sense of purpose I hadn't felt in years. This wasn't decorating someone else's vision of domestic perfection. This was creating a space that reflected my own aesthetic and functional needs. I chose furniture that was modern but warm, professional but comfortable, everything designed to support both productive work and genuine relaxation. The freedom to make decisions based purely on my own preferences felt revolutionary after years of compromise and coordination. David was supposedly at the office working on weekend project deadlines, which gave me the entire day to plan and purchase without having to explain my activities. The independence was intoxicating. No need to discuss major purchases or justify spending decisions or coordinate schedules around someone else's priorities. I was rediscovering what it felt like to be a complete person, rather than half of a couple. My phone buzzed with a text from Monica while I was comparing desk options. "How's the apartment hunting going? Found anything promising?" Her continued investment in my situation felt like having a personal advocate, someone whose professional expertise was focused entirely on my best interests, rather than maintaining some fictional balance between competing priorities. "Found the perfect place and signed the lease," I replied. "Moving in Wednesday. Ready to start the next phase of Operation Independence." Her response came immediately. "Excellent. I've been researching David's business structure and found some interesting information about TechFlow's recent valuation. We should meet Monday to discuss strategy for maximizing your settlement." The prospect of holding David financially accountable for the dissolution of our marriage felt increasingly important, not out of vindictiveness but as a matter of basic fairness. If our shared assets had been used to support his affair, if my professional sacrifices had contributed to his business success, if my domestic labor had enabled his career advancement, all of that deserved recognition in the final accounting of our partnership. Sunday passed in a blur of packing and organizing, separating my personal belongings from our shared possessions in preparation for the move. The process was surprisingly emotional, not because I was sad to leave these things behind, but because I was discovering how little of our beautiful home actually reflected my individual taste and personality. Most of my books were stored in boxes in the garage, because David preferred minimalist shelving. My art collection was limited to pieces that complemented his decorating vision. Even my clothing had gradually shifted toward styles that matched his preferences for how I should present myself at his business functions. Reclaiming these items felt like archaeological excavation, uncovering layers of my identity that had been buried under years of accommodation and compromise. Each rediscovered book or forgotten photograph reminded me of interests and passions I'd set aside in the service of marital harmony. The woman I'd been before David was still there, just dormant under years of trying to be the perfect wife for someone who hadn't deserved the effort. Monday morning brought my second meeting with Monica, this time in her downtown law office rather than the casual setting of our lunch conversation. The change in venue reflected the evolution of our discussions from personal support to professional strategy. Monica's conference room was designed to project both competence and intimidation, exactly the kind of environment where David would realize how seriously I was taking this process. I've completed the preliminary research on TechFlow's business structure and recent valuations, Monica began, spreading documents across her polished conference table. The company has grown significantly more valuable than you probably realized, particularly in the past 2 years, when David's been claiming those late nights were all about work. The financial information was staggering. TechFlow's estimated value had nearly tripled since our last conversation about David's business prospects, driven by several major contracts and technological innovations that had positioned the company as a leader in their specialty market. If Monica's calculations were correct, my share of David's business equity alone would provide more than enough capital to launch my marketing agency with proper funding and professional infrastructure. How much of this increase can be attributed to my contributions? I asked, thinking about the countless hours I'd spent supporting David's networking efforts and managing our household so he could focus entirely on business development. That's where this gets interesting, Monica replied, pulling out another set of documents. I've been analyzing the timeline of TechFlow's major successes against your professional sacrifices and domestic contributions. The correlation is remarkable. She showed me a detailed timeline that mapped my career compromises against David's business milestones. The promotion I'd turned down, because it would have required travel that conflicted with his product launch schedule. The client I'd referred to a competitor, because serving them would have demanded attention during his crucial investor presentation period. The networking events I'd skipped to host dinner parties for his business contacts. Each decision had seemed minor at the time, but their cumulative effect had been to systematically prioritize his professional advancement over mine. We can make a strong argument that your direct and indirect contributions to David's business success entitle you to a significant share of TechFlow's value, Monica continued. Especially if we can demonstrate that the affair consumed time and resources that should have been dedicated to the marriage and shared financial goals. The prospect of not just surviving the divorce but emerging from it in a stronger financial position than I'd ever enjoyed during the marriage felt like justice rather than revenge. David had chosen to violate our partnership in the most fundamental way possible. The consequences should reflect the seriousness of that betrayal. What about timeline for confrontation? I asked, eager to move from planning to implementation. I recommend this Thursday, Monica replied. That gives us 3 more days to finalize documentation and strategy, but doesn't leave David time to make significant financial moves if he suspects anything. Plus, approaching him on a weekday when he's thinking about work rather than personal relationships might keep him more focused on practical resolution rather than emotional manipulation. Thursday felt both impossibly soon and frustratingly distant. Part of me wanted to confront David immediately, to stop pretending everything was normal when our marriage had become an elaborate performance piece. But the strategic part of my mind recognized the value of thorough preparation, especially when dealing with someone who'd proven himself capable of sustained deception. I want him served with papers at his office, I decided, surprising myself with the firmness of the statement. Not at home, not somewhere private where he can try to manipulate the situation. I want this to be official and public enough that he understands I'm not interested in negotiation or emotional appeals. Monica's smile was sharp with approval. Excellent instinct. Public service also creates witnesses to his reaction, which can be valuable if he tries to claim later that he was blindsided or that you were acting irrationally. We spent the next 2 hours reviewing every detail of the divorce filing, property division demands, and temporary support arrangements. The documents were comprehensive and devastating, designed to leave David no room for the kind of smooth talking that had characterized our entire relationship. This wasn't a conversation he could charm his way through or a problem he could solve with the right combination of apology and promise. Tuesday and Wednesday passed in a strange bubble of heightened activity and emotional detachment. I moved my essential belongings to the loft while David was at work, creating a functional living space that felt immediately more like home than our lakeside house had in months. The freedom to arrange everything according to my own preferences was intoxicating, from the coffee maker positioned to catch morning sunlight to the bookshelf organized by subject rather than aesthetic appeal. David noticed my distracted energy but attributed it to work stress, accepting my explanations about the DeSantis campaign's demanding timeline without question. His continued self-absorption was almost helpful, providing cover for activities he might have questioned if he'd been paying closer attention to my actual behavior rather than just monitoring for potential threats to his comfortable arrangement. Wednesday evening, I cooked dinner with unusual care, though not for David's benefit. This was the last meal I'd prepare as his wife, the final performance of domestic harmony before everything changed forever. The ritual felt important somehow, a way of honoring what our marriage had been before acknowledging what it had become. "You seem different lately," David observed over the salmon and risotto I'd prepared with probably too much attention to detail. "More energetic, but also more distant. Everything okay with DeSantis account?" The question was closer to genuine interest than he'd shown in months, and I wondered if some unconscious part of him sensed the approaching crisis. His timing was ironic. He was finally noticing my emotional state just as I was preparing to end our relationship permanently. "Just thinking about the future," I replied truthfully. "Sometimes you reach a point where you have to make significant changes to get what you really want." David nodded absently, already checking his phone for messages that were probably from Ashley. His inability to maintain focus, even during direct conversation about my emotional state, felt like the perfect encapsulation of why our marriage had failed. He wanted the benefits of being married without the actual work of being a partner. That night, I lay awake beside him with a calmness I hadn't expected. Tomorrow would bring confrontation, legal proceedings, and the public dissolution of the life we'd built together. But instead of anxiety or regret, I felt something closer to anticipation. The woman who'd rebuilt failing companies was about to rebuild her own life, and this time, she wouldn't be compromising her vision to accommodate someone else's agenda. Thursday morning dawned clear and bright, the kind of perfect Austin weather that made everything seem possible. David left for work with his usual distracted efficiency, completely unaware that he was walking into the most important day of his professional life for reasons that had nothing to do with business. I watched his Tesla disappear down our street for what I knew would be the last time, feeling nothing but mild curiosity about how he'd react when the papers were served. At exactly 11 o'clock, Monica texted me, "Process server is at TechFlow. This is happening." I was sitting in my new loft, surrounded by boxes and furniture that represented my independent future, when my phone rang with David's number. His voice when I answered was tight with controlled panic, the tone of someone trying to maintain composure while his entire world shifted beneath him. "Jessica, we need to talk," he said without preamble. "There's been some kind of misunderstanding. Can you come to the office? Or I can come home right now." "There's no misunderstanding," I replied calmly. "You've been having an affair with Ashley Chen. I have documentation of your activities and communications. The divorce papers accurately reflect my understanding of our situation." The silence on his end stretched long enough for me to wonder if the call had dropped. When he finally spoke, his voice had changed completely, dropping the pretense of confusion in favor of damage control mode. "How long have you known?" he asked, and I almost laughed at the question. Even now, his primary concern was managing information rather than acknowledging the hurt he'd caused. "Long enough to make informed decisions about my future," I replied. "My attorney will be in touch about scheduling depositions and asset discovery. I suggest you hire representation soon." "Jessica, please, let's not do this through lawyers," David said, his voice taking on the persuasive tone he used for difficult business negotiations. "We can work this out privately, figure out something that works for both of us." "We could have worked things out privately if you'd been honest about wanting something different from our marriage," I replied. "But you chose deception instead of communication, so now we'll handle this through appropriate legal channels." I ended the call before he could launch into whatever speech he'd prepared about temporary insanity or recommitment to our relationship. Those conversations belonged to a different version of this story, one where I still believed David was someone worth fighting for, rather than someone I needed protection from. The phone rang again immediately, but I let it go to voicemail. Then again. By the fourth call, I simply turned off the ringer and returned to the business of building my new life. Whatever David wanted to say could be communicated through his attorney once he hired one. Over the next several hours, my phone filled with increasingly desperate messages from David. ranging from angry accusations to tearful apologies to business-like proposals for settlement discussions. The progression was fascinating from a psychological perspective, watching him cycle through every manipulation technique he'd probably used successfully in other crisis situations. None of them would work here, because I was no longer the woman who'd prioritized peace over self-respect. Carmen arrived that evening with champagne and takeout from my favorite Thai restaurant, ready to celebrate what she'd always seen as an inevitable and necessary development. We sat in my new living room, surrounded by boxes and possibilities, toasting to independence and new beginnings. "I have to admit," Carmen said, settling onto my new sofa with her wine, "I never thought you'd actually go through with it. You were so committed to making that marriage work, even when it was obvious David didn't deserve the effort." Her honesty was both painful and liberating. How many people had watched me diminish myself for David's comfort? How many friends and family members had bitten their tongues while I explained away his selfishness and justified his priorities? The realization that my determination to save the marriage had been transparent to everyone except me was humbling. I think I needed to reach a point where saving myself became more important than saving the relationship, I reflected. David's affair wasn't the beginning of our problems. It was just the moment I finally stopped making excuses for them. We spent the evening planning the launch of my marketing agency, discussing everything from business licensing to office space to potential clients who might be interested in more personalized service than larger firms could provide. The Santa's campaign had generated significant industry attention, and several other business owners had already expressed interest in working with me independently. "You're going to be so much more successful on your own," Carmen predicted with certainty. "You've been holding yourself back to make David feel important, but you're actually the more talented one. Now everyone will see it." Late that night, alone in my beautiful new space, I reflected on the journey that had brought me here. 3 weeks ago, I'd been Mrs. David Martinez, successful but subordinate, accomplished but accommodating. Tonight, I was simply Jessica Martinez, with all the freedom and responsibility that individual identity entailed. My phone buzzed with one final text from David. "I love you. We can fix this. Please don't throw away 8 years over one mistake." I studied the message for a long moment, noting the familiar pattern of minimizing his behavior while demanding forgiveness without consequences. One mistake. As if months of systematic deception and betrayal could be reduced to a simple error in judgment that deserved immediate absolution. I deleted the message without responding and turned off my phone for the night. Tomorrow would bring new challenges as we navigated the legal and financial complexities of dissolving our shared life. But tonight, for the first time in years, I fell asleep planning my own future rather than supporting someone else's vision. The next morning brought news that TechFlow's expansion deal had been officially approved, making David's business equity even more valuable than Monica's initial calculations had projected. The irony was perfect. His professional success would fund my independence in ways he'd never intended. The woman he'd underestimated was about to become his most expensive mistake. 6 months later, Martinez Strategy Consulting had secured its 5th major client and hired its first full-time employee. The Santa's campaign had become a case study in successful crisis management, and my reputation for authentic brand rehabilitation had generated more business than I could handle alone. David had contested the divorce settlement initially, but eventually accepted terms that left me financially secure and professionally independent. Ashley Chen had left TechFlow 3 months after our divorce was finalized, apparently discovering that David was less appealing as a permanent partner than as a forbidden affair. David's attempts at reconciliation had gradually decreased in frequency before stopping altogether when he realized I was genuinely happier without him. Standing in my downtown office, watching Austin's skyline through windows that belonged entirely to me, I thought about the text message that had started this transformation. "Your wife doesn't satisfy you." Ashley had meant to wound me with that revelation, but instead she'd provided the catalyst for rebuilding my life on terms that actually did satisfy me. The woman who'd discovered her husband's affair had become someone infinitely more powerful. A woman who'd discovered her own worth and built something beautiful around it. That was a satisfaction no marriage could provide and no betrayal could take away. 2 years after that devastating text message changed everything, I stood in the penthouse conference room of the Preston Tower, presenting a comprehensive rebranding strategy to the board of directors of Meridian Holdings, one of Austin's most influential investment firms. The irony wasn't lost on me that this was the same company that had once tried to acquire my fledgling Phoenix-like venture when I was still emerging from the wreckage of my marriage. Now they were paying premium rates for Martina's strategy consulting's expertise, and I was the one in control of the terms. The perception management campaign we're proposing addresses not just the immediate crisis, but the underlying brand architecture that made your company vulnerable to this type of reputational damage, I explained to the 12 executives gathered around the gleaming mahogany table. Authentic transformation requires more than surface-level messaging adjustments. The presentation concluded to enthusiastic approval and a contract that would represent the largest single engagement in my company's history. As the board members filed out, discussing implementation timelines and budget allocations, I gathered my materials with the quiet satisfaction of someone who'd built something genuinely valuable through their own vision and effort. My assistant Amanda, now my director of client relations, approached with her tablet full of scheduling updates and priority messages. Jessica, David Martinez called the office again this morning, third time this month. He's asking to schedule a meeting about potential collaboration between TechFlow and our agency. The persistence was almost admirable, if it weren't so transparently self-serving. David's technology company had struggled significantly since our divorce, not just because of the financial settlement that had required him to buy out my stake in his business equity, but because he'd apparently overestimated his own role in TechFlow's previous success. Without the domestic stability I'd provided and the networking connections I'd facilitated, his business development had stagnated noticeably. Same response as always, I replied, checking my phone for messages from actual priority contacts. Martinez Strategy Consulting doesn't work with clients where personal conflicts might compromise professional objectivity. Refer him to competing agencies if he needs marketing consultation. Amanda nodded with the slight smile of someone who enjoyed delivering diplomatic rejections to persistent ex-husbands. She'd been my first hire when the business expanded beyond what I could manage alone. A recent graduate from UT's communications program who brought fresh energy and contemporary perspectives to our client strategies. Watching her professional development over the past 18 months had been one of the unexpected joys of entrepreneurship. The elevator ride down to street level gave me a moment to reflect on how completely my life had transformed since that night I'd discovered Ashley's text message. The woman who'd been devastated by her husband's betrayal had become someone who commanded respect in Austin's competitive business landscape. Someone whose expertise was sought by companies facing their own crises of authenticity and reputation. Martinez Strategy Consulting occupied the entire 7th floor of a renovated office building in downtown Austin, with space for 12 employees and room to expand as our client base continued growing. The modern industrial aesthetic reflected my own design preferences rather than compromised solutions, and every detail from the reception furniture to the conference room technology had been chosen to project competence and innovation. Walking through my company's offices never got old. These weren't spaces I'd inherited or adapted from someone else's vision. They represented the physical manifestation of my professional ambitions, built from the ground up according to my own standards and priorities. The open floor plan encouraged collaboration while maintaining designated quiet zones for focused work. The client meeting areas balanced sophistication with approachability. The employee break room featured amenities that supported work-life balance rather than demanding workaholic dedication. My corner office offered panoramic views of Lady Bird Lake and the hills beyond, the same landscape I'd once admired from the house I'd shared with David. But this view belonged entirely to me, earned through my own efforts rather than gifted as part of someone else's success story. The symbolism felt important every time I looked out those windows, a reminder of how far I'd traveled from the woman who'd defined herself primarily as David's wife. The afternoon brought a video conference with Maria Santos, whose food truck empire had not only recovered from its initial crisis but expanded to 23 locations across Texas. Our ongoing relationship had evolved from crisis management to growth strategy, and Maria had become both a valuable client and a genuine friend. Her success story served as a case study for authentic brand rehabilitation that had attracted numerous other clients facing similar challenges. "Jessica, I have exciting news," Maria announced through the video screen. her enthusiasm immediately infectious. The Food Network wants to feature our recovery story in their upcoming documentary about small business resilience. They specifically mentioned how your strategic guidance made the difference between collapse and expansion. The recognition was gratifying both professionally and personally. When I'd first taken on Maria's account, I'd been motivated partly by the parallel between her situation and my own need for reinvention. Helping her rebuild had provided a framework for rebuilding myself, and watching her thrive felt like validation of the instincts that had guided my own transformation. That's incredible, Maria. National exposure like that will position you perfectly for the franchise expansion we've been discussing. Have they committed to a timeline for production? We spent the next hour planning how to maximize the documentary opportunity while maintaining the authentic messaging that had driven her successful comeback. The strategic thinking required was complex and nuanced, exactly the kind of challenge that reminded me why I'd always been more fulfilled by marketing work than by domestic management, despite David's frequent suggestions that I was naturally suited for traditional wife roles. After the call ended, I took a moment to check my personal messages, finding texts from Carmen about weekend plans, and from Monica about a legal matter involving one of my clients. Both relationships had strengthened significantly since my divorce, partly because I was no longer filtering every friendship through David's preferences and judgments. The social isolation I'd experienced during my marriage hadn't been entirely his fault, but his subtle discouragements of my independent relationships had gradually eroded my support network in ways I'd only recognized after rebuilding it. My phone buzzed with an unknown number, and I almost declined the call before recognizing the area code as one frequently used by potential clients. Martinez Strategy Consulting, this is Jessica. Ms. Martinez, this is Rebecca Thompson from Thompson Holdings. We spoke briefly at the Austin Business Council reception last month about potential collaboration on our upcoming acquisition announcement. I remembered the conversation, though it had been one of dozens of similar networking interactions at the event. Thompson Holdings was a significant player in commercial real estate development, and their acquisition campaigns typically required sophisticated public relations management to address community concerns about gentrification and local business displacement. Of course, Ms. Thompson. How can Martina's strategy help with your announcement strategy? The conversation that followed resulted in another major client engagement, this one involving a particularly sensitive acquisition that would require careful community outreach and stakeholder management. The complexity of the challenge was exactly what I thrived on, requiring the kind of nuanced, strategic thinking that had always been my greatest professional strength. By the time I left the office that evening, Martina's Strategy Consulting had secured enough new business to require hiring 2 additional strategists within the next month. The growth was exciting but also slightly overwhelming, requiring the kind of scaling decisions I'd never had to make when working for someone else's company. Every choice about staff expansion, office space, and client capacity would determine the future trajectory of the business I'd built. Driving home to my downtown loft, I passed the Hill Country Club, where I'd once conducted surveillance on David's lunch meetings with Ashley. The memory felt like something from someone else's life, emotionally distant despite being chronologically recent. The woman who'd hidden in that club's library, gathering evidence of her husband's betrayal, had been replaced by someone who commanded boardrooms and built businesses rather than monitoring other people's activities. The loft had evolved significantly since my first desperate move-in day, becoming a sophisticated living space that balanced professional functionality with personal comfort. The main room still served as overflow office space when needed, but I'd added artwork and furnishings that reflected my actual aesthetic preferences, rather than compromise solutions designed to please someone else. That evening, I video called my mother Elena, maintaining the weekly tradition we'd established since my divorce. Our relationship had improved dramatically once I'd stopped trying to present my marriage as perfect and started sharing the challenges and victories of building an independent life. "Mija, you look radiant," she observed with the directness that had sometimes irritated me during my marriage but now felt like essential honesty. "Success suits you much better than trying to be the perfect wife ever did." Her perspective on my transformation had been particularly valuable because she'd witnessed the gradual erosion of my confidence during my marriage, even when I'd been too close to the situation to recognize it myself. "I've been thinking about the work-life balance questions you raised last week," I replied. settling onto my sofa with tea and the stack of business publications I'd been meaning to review. The expansion opportunities are incredible, but I want to make sure I'm building something sustainable rather than just chasing growth for its own sake. We discussed the strategic decisions facing Martinez Strategy Consulting, from staffing philosophy to client selection criteria to long-term vision for the company's role in Austin's business community. My mother's insights were surprisingly sophisticated, drawing from her own experience managing household finances and family logistics in ways that paralleled business management challenges. Remember that you have choices now that you didn't have before, she counseled wisely. David always made decisions based on what would benefit him most, and you adapted your goals to support his priorities. Now you can make decisions based on what will make you genuinely happy and fulfilled. Her observation highlighted something I'd been gradually recognizing about my post-divorce life: the freedom to make decisions based entirely on my own values and preferences, rather than constantly negotiating compromises with someone whose priorities often conflicted with mine. The liberation was still occasionally overwhelming, like suddenly having access to a full spectrum of colors after years of seeing in black and white. Later that evening, I reviewed financial projections for the business expansion, marveling at numbers that represented genuine prosperity built through my own efforts. The divorce settlement from David had provided crucial startup capital, but the success of Martinez Strategy Consulting was entirely attributable to my own professional expertise and business development skills. The distinction felt important, separating what I'd accomplished independently from what I'd gained through the dissolution of my marriage. My laptop chimed with an email from an unexpected sender, Ashley Chen. The subject line read, "Professional congratulations and personal apologies," and I stared at it for several minutes before deciding to open it. Curiosity outweighed any lingering animosity, and I was genuinely interested in what she might have to say after 2 years of silence. Jessica, I've been following the success of Martinez Strategy Consulting through industry publications and mutual professional connections. Your achievement in building such a respected company in such a short time is genuinely impressive and deserving of recognition. I also want to acknowledge that my actions during your marriage were inexcusable, regardless of the circumstances that led to them. I hope you'll accept my sincere apology for the pain I caused during an already difficult period in your life. I wish you continued success in all your endeavors, Ashley. The message was more thoughtful and less self-serving than I'd expected, though I wondered what had prompted her to reach out after so much time. Perhaps her own life had changed in ways that provided perspective on the collateral damage of her affair with David. Or perhaps success had made me safe to apologize to, someone who clearly hadn't been destroyed by their betrayal and therefore might be capable of magnanimous forgiveness. I considered responding but ultimately decided against it. Ashley's apology might be sincere, but it wasn't necessary for my own peace of mind or professional advancement. The crisis that had nearly destroyed me had ultimately provided the catalyst for building something far better than what I'd lost. Her guilt was her own burden to manage. I had no interest in absolving her of consequences for choices that had worked out better for me than continued marriage to David ever would have. The next morning brought news that TechFlow was being acquired by a larger technology firm, with David remaining as a regional manager rather than maintaining his previous executive status. The reduction in his professional standing felt like natural consequences rather than satisfying revenge, the inevitable result of his own limitations being exposed when he no longer had my support to mask them. Carmen called that afternoon with updates on David's attempts to sell the lakeside house, apparently struggling to find buyers willing to pay what he needed to cover the remaining mortgage and property taxes. He's dropped the price twice in the past 3 months, she reported with professional detachment. The market's competitive, and that house was always overpriced for what it actually offered. The information was interesting, but not particularly relevant to my current life. David's financial struggles were consequences of his own choices, just as my current success was the result of mine. The parallel paths our lives had taken since our divorce illustrated how much our marriage had been holding both of us back, him from honestly confronting his limitations, and me from fully developing my potential. That weekend, I attended the Austin Women in Business Annual Gala, where Martinez Strategy Consulting was being recognized as Small Business of the Year. The award represented validation from my professional peers and acknowledgement of what I'd built in less than 2 years of independent operation. Standing at the podium to accept the recognition, I looked out at an audience of women who'd supported my journey from devastated wife to successful entrepreneur. Building this company taught me that sometimes the worst thing that happens to you becomes the catalyst for discovering who you were always meant to become, I said in my acceptance speech. The words carrying weight from lived experience rather than motivational platitudes. Success isn't about surviving crisis. It's about using crisis to reveal strengths you didn't know you possessed. The standing ovation that followed felt like collective celebration of everyone who'd ever been underestimated, overlooked, or dismissed by people who should have valued them. In that moment, surrounded by successful women who'd built their own versions of independent achievement, I understood that my story wasn't unique in its broad strokes. Many of us had discovered our true capabilities only after being forced to advocate for ourselves, in situations where no one else would. Walking to my car after the event, I reflected on the journey that had brought me from that devastating text message to this moment of professional recognition. The woman who'd been destroyed by discovering her husband's affair had been reborn as someone who couldn't be diminished by anyone else's choices or opinions. That transformation was worth more than any marriage could have provided, more valuable than any external validation could confirm. My phone rang with Monica's number, probably calling to congratulate me on the award she'd been unable to attend due to a conflicting court appearance. Jessica, I just saw the photos from the gala on social media. You look absolutely radiant, and that award is so well deserved. Thank you for everything you did to make this possible, I replied, meaning it completely. Your legal guidance during the divorce created the foundation for everything I've built since then. You created this success yourself, Monica corrected firmly. I just made sure David couldn't sabotage your opportunities for rebuilding. Everything you've accomplished is the result of your own talent and determination. Her perspective was generous, but accurate. The divorce settlement had provided startup capital and legal protection, but the vision, strategy, and execution that built Martinez Strategy Consulting belonged entirely to me. I'd discovered capabilities I'd never known I possessed, developed confidence I'd never been allowed to express, and created something that reflected my own values rather than compromising to accommodate someone else's limitations. Driving home through Austin's glittering downtown, I thought about the text message that had started this transformation. Your wife doesn't satisfy you. Ashley had intended those words to wound me, to establish her superiority in some imagined competition for David's attention. Instead, she'd provided the revelation that finally allowed me to stop trying to satisfy someone who was fundamentally unsatisfiable and start building a life that satisfied me. The woman who discovered her husband's betrayal had become someone infinitely more powerful, a woman who discovered her own worth and built something magnificent around it. That was a satisfaction no marriage could provide and no betrayal could diminish. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.